February 14th, 1945, Lichtenwald, Germany. The order wasn't shouted. There were no blows, no insults. It was delivered in a flat, almost bureaucratic murmur, like a routine formality, no different from asking for papers or checking supplies. I want to see your feet. Elena Weiss was 18 years old and had not taken off her shoes in 3 weeks. When those words were spoken inside Barrack Number 7 of the Lichtenwald concentration camp, the frozen February air seemed to thicken, to press down on her, as if the cold itself were trying to force her into the rotting wooden floor. No one understood what was happening. It wasn't an order to go to the quarries. It wasn't a familiar punishment. It wasn't a selection for the gas chambers, nor a forced march through the snow. It was something else, something unknown. And in Nazi camps, the unknown was always more terrifying than what was already understood. Beside her, Miriam Kaplan, only 16, began to shake uncontrollably. Her hands tried to clutch the edge of her frayed dress, but her fingers refused to obey, twitching like dry branches rattled by the wind. She didn't ask any questions. In the camps, questions were dangerous. Questions were paid for with beatings, days without food, arbitrary punishments, or something worse. Rosa Malin tried to remain upright, but a sharp pain in her legs forced her to lean against the damp wooden wall, heavy with the smell of mold and slow decay. She was 31 years old, and in that moment, every year of her life seemed to collapse onto her shoulders at once. Sarah Blum, 24, once a literature student before the war, shattered her life and her plans, lowered her gaze to the frozen mud on the floor. She was certain the order concealed a public humiliation designed to break whatever scraps of dignity she still possessed. Hannah Rosen, a 39-year-old widow, did not react at all. Her face remained motionless, like a stone mask carved centuries earlier. Silence was her only defense. She had not cried in months. She had not felt anything in months either. One by one, the prisoners were forced toward the center of the barrack. The frost-covered floor creaked beneath the bare feet of some women. The smell of dampness, of cheap disinfectant that cleaned nothing, of unwashed bodies and raw fear blended into a suffocating stench. When the first fingers began untying the laces of ruined shoes, some women broke down in silent sobs, mute tears, because even crying could be punished. Others whispered pleas barely louder than breath, praying in Yiddish, in Polish, in broken German, begging for it to end quickly. No one explained anything. No one answered. The guard's silence was more terrifying than any shout. SS Obersturmführer Otto Keller stood at the barrack entrance, watching with a sharply angled face devoid of expression. There was no rage in him, no visible cruelty, only routine. A cold, methodical routine, calculated like a mathematical operation. In his left hand, a black leather notebook. In his right, a pencil. As if he were counting livestock at a rural market. His boots shone despite the mud. His uniform was immaculate. He was a man doing his job without questioning, without thinking, without feeling. When the first shoes hit the floor with a dull thud that shattered the tense silence, the crying multiplied. The feet were swollen beyond recognition, almost inhuman. The skin was cracked, bleeding quietly, leaving dark red stains on the gray wood. Open wounds caused by extreme cold, constant moisture, and endless marches through snow that never seemed to melt. Some women could barely feel their own feet anymore. Circulation had failed weeks earlier. Others screamed as blood tried to return to veins that seemed to have forgotten their purpose, long surrendered to the eternal cold. They believed this was just another degradation. They thought this moment marked the beginning of something even worse, something unspeakable their minds refused to imagine. But none of them knew then, as the ice of the floor burned through the naked skin of their ruined feet and fear sealed their throats, that this simple, cruel-looking order would decide who would still be alive at dawn and who would not survive the night approaching with its merciless darkness. If this story truly reached you, support it with a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. If you want to back this project even more, you can become a member. And if the video stayed with you, tap the thanks button. It helps us keep telling stories like this one. Tell me in the comments too, which city and country you're watching from. I want to know from where you're standing with those the story tried to silence. To understand why that order existed, we have to return to a very specific moment in World War II. By February 1945, Europe was sinking into the final collapse of the Third Reich. Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly from the east, liberating territory after territory.
At the same time, the Allies were pushing from the west, crossing rivers, taking cities, dismantling what little remained of Germany's military machine. Germany was bleeding on two fronts at once. Berlin burned under Allied bombs. Every night, supply lines broke down. Fuel ran dry. Food vanished. But inside the concentration camps, the war wore a different face. No bombs fell from the sky. No tanks rolled through the streets. There, the enemy was quieter and deadlier winter. Lichtenwald, located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin near the small town of Fürstenberg, was the largest concentration camp designed exclusively for women in the entire Nazi system. It opened in May 1939, 6 months before the war began, with an initial capacity of 3,000 prisoners.
By 1945, more than 130,000 women from across occupied Europe had passed through its gates. Jewish women from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Polish resistance members, Russian women captured during military operations, French women accused of sabotage, Czech, Dutch, Belgian, and Norwegian prisoners, political dissidents who had spoken against the regime, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith, Roma women persecuted simply for existing. They all shared the same fate, forced labor until death. The Nazi system had perfected ways of killing without gas chambers, and in Lichtenwald, death arrived through methods just as effective. Calculated starvation that stripped bodies down to bones beneath the skin. Untreated diseases spreading through barracks where 100 women were crammed into spaces meant for 30. Hypothermia caused by the absence of heating during winters that plunged to 20 degrees below zero. Extreme exhaustion after 14-hour workdays without rest. Systematic beatings that shattered bones and destroyed organs. Medical experiments carried out without anesthesia. And in the winter of 1945, the coldest in decades, when temperatures collapsed and snow buried everything under a white blanket that seemed endless, the prisoners' feet became a new, invisible battlefield. Elena Weiss arrived at Lichtenwald in December 1944. She had just turned 18 and had an entire life ahead of her, one she would never get to live. Before the war, she worked in a textile factory in Piotrków Trybunalski, her hometown in central Poland, until the Nazis wiped out everything that had been her world. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, with dark hair that had once shone like silk and brown eyes that once reflected a childlike curiosity. Now they showed only exhaustion. Exhaustion from living, from fear, even from breathing. Her most distinctive trait was a gesture she repeated without realizing it. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself whenever she heard an order, as if trying to contain the trembling that threatened to give her away, to expose her weakness. And in Lichtenwald, showing weakness was the same as signing your own death sentence. Rosa Malin had worked in a grain warehouse in Semikal, a border town between Poland and what was then the Soviet Union, before the war destroyed her life with almost surgical precision. At 31, Rosa Malin had already witnessed her husband's death. Jaime was shot against a ghetto wall while she was forced to watch. The Nazis insisted that wives be present at executions. They wanted the horror burned in forever, and they succeeded. From that day on, she walked with a visible limp, dragging her right foot slightly behind her. Her feet were always swollen, covered in sores that never closed, wounds that oozed a yellowish fluid, soaking the improvised rags she used as bandages. Every step was a silent agony. She endured it without complaint, without sound, because complaining meant dying sooner. Because the weak didn't last. Sarah Blum, 24, had studied literature at the University of Warsaw. Her brown hair, once lively, now hung dull and filthy, crawling with lice that could never be fully eradicated. Before the war, she dreamed of teaching, of opening a bookstore, of writing poetry. Now she focused on surviving one more day, then another and another. She hid her ruined feet, destroyed by forced marches, beneath scraps stolen from the sewing workshops where prisoners made uniforms for the German army. She knew that if guards saw the true condition of her wounds, she would be labeled unproductive. And in Lichtenwald, the unproductive did not last. They were sent to the gas chambers installed in 1944, or simply left to starve in isolation barracks. Hanna Rosen, the 39-year-old widow from Lublin, was different. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her silence ran so deep it unsettled even the other prisoners. She had lost both her children, 7-year-old Mordecai and 5-year-old Sarah, killed in the ghetto during a clearing action in the winter of 1942, murdered in front of her. Something inside her had broken beyond repair, something no doctor could fix, no words could soothe, but she was still alive, still obeying orders mechanically, still dragging her frozen feet through icy mud every morning when the whistles tore the prisoners from sleep at 4 a.m. Miriam Kaplan was the youngest, 16 years old, though she looked 60. She had been deported alone from Kielce, a city in central Poland, after her entire family was executed in front of her in the ghetto's main square. Her father, her mother, and her 3 younger brothers, all shot while she was forced to watch. The Nazis had a particular fondness for making survivors witness executions. They wanted trauma so deep it could never be erased. Miriam barely understood most of the shouted orders in German. She obeyed on pure animal instinct, driven by panic, the kind that keeps lungs working and hearts beating. Despite everything, these women shared Barrack Number 7, a wooden structure 20 meters long and 8 wide, designed on paper for 40 prisoners. In reality, it held 120. They slept on wooden bunks without mattresses or blankets, pressed tightly together to conserve warmth. Where 2 bodies should have fit, 5 women were crammed in, sharing lice that multiplied unchecked in the heat of piled flesh. They shared diseases that spread in the darkness: tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, scabies. They also shared the night's silence, broken only by sobs muffled into rags so guards wouldn't hear, by whispered prayers in Hebrew few understood, by moans of pain no one could ease because there were no medicines, no cures, no hope. The routine never changed. Wake up at 4 a.m., whistles cutting through sleep like knives. 15 minutes to use latrines shared by 300 women. 10 minutes for breakfast. Hot water faintly tasting of coffee and a 50-gram piece of black bread. 30 minutes marching to work sites under guard with dogs. 12 hours of labor without rest. 30 minutes marching back. 30 minutes for dinner. Watery soup with rotten vegetables and another piece of bread. Then 2 free hours when prisoners tried to wash clothes in icy water, patch destroyed shoes, or simply rest, if their bodies still remembered how. Before the cycle began again, that February morning they shared something else as well. The strangest order they had heard since arriving. An order that made no sense. Different. Terrifying precisely because it didn't fit into anything familiar. That order, the one they didn't understand and that filled them with dread, had its origins 3 days before the foot inspection. Dr. Ernst Vogel, the physician assigned to Lichtenwald, had received an urgent telegram from Berlin. The message was unambiguous. The mortality rate among female prisoners was directly affecting the productivity of the textile factories, munitions workshops, and electrical component plants operating inside the camp. The women were dying too quickly, not because of a formal extermination plan, but because of a system of deliberate neglect. No basic treatment, medical abandonment, non-existent sanitary conditions. And from the Nazis' pragmatic logic, this was inefficient. Dead workers produced nothing, and war production came first. Vogel was 42 years old and carried a past no one fully knew. He had served as a military doctor on the Eastern Front, in the frozen Russian steppes, before being transferred to Lichtenwald for reasons never officially explained. Among the prisoner nurses, rumors circulated quietly. Some said he had protested mass executions of civilians in a Ukrainian village. Others claimed he had simply broken mentally after witnessing too many atrocities. What was certain was this: his gaze always seemed exhausted, fixed on some distant point no one else could see. And his hands, stained with a diluted antiseptic barely capable of cleaning superficial wounds, trembled slightly when he held medical instruments. A tremor almost invisible, but constant. For 2 consecutive days, Vogel reviewed the camp's medical records, stored in a cold, damp room that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic death. In January 1945 alone, 437 prisoners had died in Lichtenwald. Of those, 212 deaths were directly linked to infections of the lower extremities: gangrene, septicemia, untreated trench foot, advanced necrosis. A silent epidemic that had never been officially documented. Deaths were recorded as heart failure or general exhaustion, vague causes that explained nothing and made the problem easy to ignore. Trench foot was a devastating medical condition that had crippled entire armies during World War I. At Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, it had removed more soldiers from combat than enemy bullets. Military doctors feared it because it was quiet, progressive, and relentless. It developed when feet remained wet and cold for prolonged periods, days or weeks, without ever fully drying. Blood circulation dropped drastically as vessels constricted in a desperate attempt by the body to preserve heat for vital organs. The skin swelled first, becoming pale and soft, like raw dough. Then deep cracks formed, exposing inner layers of tissue. Blisters appeared, filled with a yellowish, waxy fluid that eventually burst, leaving raw flesh exposed to cold and omnipresent bacteria. Infections followed, feeding on dead tissue and multiplying in constant moisture. Then came necrosis, as tissue died cell by cell, turning black or green and releasing the unmistakable stench of rot. Finally, gangrene, when the infection became irreversible and toxins poisoned the entire body. Without immediate treatment, death was almost inevitable within days or weeks. With treatment, amputation was common. Sometimes a few toes, sometimes the entire foot, sometimes the leg up to the knee. At Lichtenwald, the women worked 12 to 14 hours a day in unheated textile workshops, where the indoor temperature barely rose above the freezing air outside. They sewed uniforms for the Wehrmacht with frozen fingers, drops of blood staining the fabric, or they were sent to open quarries, breaking stone with rusted tools under unrelenting snowfall, the sound of hammers ricocheting through the frozen air. Others were assigned to electrical component factories, where icy water soaked their thin clothing non-stop, never allowing it to dry, while sparks from the machines burned exposed skin. Some were sent to build new barracks, hauling frozen bricks that shredded their hands. Others spent the day in the kitchens, peeling rotten potatoes with dull knives. The weakest ended up in the sorting workshop, separating clothing taken from executed prisoners, searching linings for hidden valuables. Their shoes, when they had any, were useless remnants of discarded German military boots, soles separating from leather, holes along the sides, or simple rags tied around their feet with string, falling apart after a week of use. Many walked barefoot over compacted snow that sliced skin like ground glass. They slept with wet feet, damp clothes freezing against their bodies, in barracks where the water in buckets turned to solid ice by morning. They could never fully dry themselves. They never had clean socks. They never rested. They never hoped. Dr. Ernst Vogel knew he couldn't save them all. Resources were scarce. Antibiotics were lacking even for wounded German soldiers at the front. But if he could identify the most severe cases, he could isolate them, apply minimal treatment with what little was available, and prevent the infection from spreading further. It wasn't humanitarianism. It wasn't compassion. It was pure Nazi pragmatism. Keep enough workers alive to keep the factories running. Keep production going. Let the dying Reich hold on one more day. That was how the order was born. A mandatory foot inspection for every prisoner in the camp. No exceptions, regardless of rank, origin, or length of imprisonment. Everyone would be examined. Institutional resistance was immediate and brutal. SS Hauptscharführer Franz Adler called the order a waste of valuable time. "They're disposable," he said during a meeting with Vogel in a small office that smelled of tobacco and burned paper. "When they die, we'll bring more from the East. There are always more Jews." Vogel answered with numbers, cold figures even a pragmatic Nazi could understand. He showed that transporting new prisoners from occupied territories was becoming nearly impossible due to the unstoppable Soviet advance. Rail lines were bombed constantly by Allied aircraft. Bridges were blown apart. Trains no longer arrived on schedule. Journeys that once took 2 days now took 2 weeks, if they arrived at all. The current prisoners were, quite literally, the last ones available. There would be no replacements. After 20 minutes of tense argument, Adler gave in, but imposed harsh conditions. The inspection had to be fast, no more than 2 days. It would be mandatory, without exception. Any prisoner who resisted, cried too loudly, or caused trouble would be executed on the spot as a public example. There would be no negotiations, no second chances. The clock started ticking. Vogel had 48 hours to inspect 3,200 prisoners. The chosen day arrived on February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day. A cruel irony no one noticed. There was no warning. The prisoners were awakened at 5 in the morning by shrill whistles and shouted orders in German, forced into uneven lines in the central yard, where temperatures dropped to 16 degrees below zero. The north wind sliced at their skin like invisible blades. Some women collapsed onto the snow before reaching the assembly point, and were left where they fell. No one could help them. Helping meant receiving the same punishment. Barrack by barrack, the women were led to a red brick building usually used to store tools and construction materials. Inside, an improvised medical station had been set up. 3 wooden tables stained with dried blood from earlier inspections. Kerosene lamps that barely lit the space and saturated the air with the smell of burned fuel. Buckets of icy water for cleaning. Scarce bandages, most of them reused. And Dr. Ernst Vogel, accompanied by 2 prisoner nurses he had personally selected. 2 Polish women who, before the war, had worked in hospitals in Warsaw. When it was Barrack number 7's turn, Elena Weiss entered first. Her legs trembled, not only from the cold that seeped into her bones, but from a paralyzing fear. Franz Adler nudged her forward gently with the tip of his cane and gave the order in German, repeated in Polish by one of the nurses. "Take off your shoes." She obeyed with hands that barely worked. Her clumsy, numb fingers took nearly a full minute to untie the broken laces she had tied and retied hundreds of times. When she finally removed the left shoe, a nauseating stench filled the room. A smell of rotting flesh, advanced infection, slow death. Her foot was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin had an unnatural gray tone, almost inhuman. 3 of her toes were completely black. Gangrene. Vogel said nothing. His face remained neutral, professional, as if he were reviewing a case from a medical textbook. He wrote something in his notebook in small, precise handwriting and motioned to a nurse. Elena was taken to a corner of the building, where other prisoners with severe infections waited in silence, sitting on the frozen concrete. Rosa Malin was next. As she tried to remove her shoes, she let out a sharp scream that cut through the silence. The footwear had been stuck to her infected skin for weeks. The rotting leather had fused with raw flesh. One of the nurses had to use warm water, an extraordinary luxury, to peel the leather away centimeter by centimeter. When her feet were finally exposed, Vogel closed his eyes for a single second, a minimal gesture of restrained horror. Both feet were covered in open sores, oozing a yellowish fluid mixed with blood. The infection had already reached her ankles, and the red line of septicemia could be seen creeping slowly toward her knees. Sarah Bloom tried to hide her ruined feet by placing one over the other, an instinctive gesture of shame and fear. But it didn't work. Vogel examined them in clinical silence, pressing gently to assess the depth of the wounds, and then moved her aside as well. Another for immediate treatment. Hannah Rosen, the silent widow who never spoke, removed her shoes without expression. No tears, no sounds. Her feet were in better condition than many others. There were no visible infections, but clear signs of frostbite marked her toes. Skin hard, waxy, circulation compromised. Vogel hesitated for a moment, his pencil hovering above the paper, then decided to leave her with the main group. She wasn't a priority. Resources were limited. Miriam Kaplan, the 16-year-old who had lost her entire family, didn't understand what was happening. When she was ordered in German to take off her shoes, she began to cry uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, sobs shaking her thin body. She thought they were going to execute her. She thought this was the end, that her moment to die had arrived. Adler shouted at her to be quiet, his voice echoing through the building. But she couldn't stop. Panic had consumed her completely. Finally, one of the nurses, a 40-year-old Polish woman named Sophia, helped her remove her shoes with unexpected gentleness. Her feet were swollen but not severely infected, showing only mild frostbite, and she was sent back to the main group. For 6 continuous hours, from 7 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon, the inspection continued without pause. Prisoner after prisoner, swollen feet, destroyed skin, blackened toes, advanced infections, wounds that had never once been treated. Vogel worked mechanically, writing, separating, classifying without pause. By the end of the day, he had identified 342 women with infections severe enough to require immediate treatment if they were to survive. But there were bandages for only 50. Antibiotics, primitive sulfonamides, for barely 30. And isolation beds in the infirmary for just 20. The breaking point came that same night, when the sun vanished and the temperature dropped even further. Vogel knew he had reached an impossible decision, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. He could not save all 342. It wasn't a matter of will or ethics. It was mathematics. The resources simply did not exist. But he could still try to save some. He chose to focus on the women whose infections had not yet crossed the point of no return. Those with advanced gangrene. Those whose toes were already completely black. Those with septicemia creeping up their legs were sent back to their barracks without treatment. It was a silent death sentence, a verdict delivered without words. Elena Weiss was among the few who were spared. Her infection was severe, 3 gangrenous toes, but not yet terminal. She was moved to a small infirmary room with 19 other women. There, Vogel and the nurses worked through the entire night under the weak glow of kerosene lamps. They cleaned wounds with boiling water mixed with antiseptic, a liquid that burned like fire against raw flesh. They applied improvised bandages made from torn sheets, boiled beforehand to sterilize them. They administered the scarce doses of sulfonamides, drugs that, at that moment, were worth more than gold. The pain was indescribable. When the hot water touched frozen, necrotic skin, the women screamed until their voices failed, screams so intense they seemed to crack the walls. Some fainted from the sheer agony. Others begged in Yiddish, in Polish, in German, pleading to be allowed to die, to be released from the suffering. Vogel did not stop. He worked with automatic precision, as if every movement had been programmed years earlier in a medical academy that now felt like it belonged to another universe. At 3 in the morning, in the deepest hour of night, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Warmth. Real warmth. Her feet were wrapped in clean bandages that smelled faintly of soap, and someone had given her dry socks stolen from a German military supply room. For the first time in months, she could feel her toes and move them just slightly. She was still alive. Rosa Malin was not as fortunate. Her infection had gone too far. Septicemia was already coursing through her body. Vogel leaned close and told her quietly, almost in a whisper meant only for her, that there was nothing more he could do, that he was sorry. She didn't respond. She simply nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for those words for a long time. She returned to her barrack and died 4 days later. On February 18, 1945, her body was found on the top bunk, her feet wrapped in the same rags she had used for months. She died alone. She died quietly. Sarah Bloom received limited treatment. Her wounds were cleaned with boiling water, but there were no antibiotics left for her. She was told to keep her feet dry and elevated whenever possible, an absurd instruction in a place where the floors were always wet and prisoners slept packed together with no room to stretch their legs. Still, she tried. Every night, she stole scraps of cloth from the sewing workshop and placed them under her feet. Every morning, she hid them before the guards could see. She survived. 3 weeks later, the numbers spoke with brutal clarity. Of the 342 prisoners identified with severe infections, 206 were dead within weeks. They died of gangrene, of septicemia, of multiple organ failure. But 136 survived. And of those 136, 89 lived long enough to be freed when Soviet troops reached Lichtenwald on April 30, 1945. The reaction among Nazi superiors was uneven, even contradictory. Some officers considered the inspection a success. It had kept enough workers alive to sustain war production. Others saw it as a waste of medical resources on subhumans who, in their view, would die anyway and did not deserve treatment. Ernst Vogel never learned what the high command in Berlin truly thought. By then, it no longer mattered to him. Too many things had stopped mattering. The human impact was deep and almost invisible. The women who received treatment never forgot that moment. They did not experience it as kindness, nor mistake it for humanity. It was a cold calculation, a pragmatic decision driven by economic logic. But inside absolute hell, even a calculation like that could draw the line between life and death, between seeing another sunrise or never seeing one again. Elena Weiss survived Lichtenwald. She was liberated on April 30, 1945, by Soviet soldiers who found the camp nearly empty. Days earlier, the Nazis had evacuated thousands of prisoners westward in death marches, forced walks during which many died along the roads. Elena was too weak to walk. Her body weighed barely 38 kilos. She hid in barrack number 7 until liberation arrived. When the Soviet soldiers entered, she lay on the bunk, half conscious, but alive. After the war, she emigrated to Israel in 1948 aboard one of the refugee ships crossing the Mediterranean. In 1950, she married a survivor of Auschwitz named David, who had lost his entire family. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. She worked as a seamstress in Tel Aviv for 40 years, seated in front of a sewing machine in a small workshop in the Florentine neighborhood. For decades, she never spoke publicly about Lichtenwald. Silence was how she moved forward. Only in 1987, when an Israeli historian contacted her for a survivor testimony project, did she agree to tell her story. In that interview, recorded in a small room in her Tel Aviv apartment, surrounded by photographs of her grandchildren, she said something that would remain forever on record. When they ordered me to take off my shoes, I thought they were going to kill me. I thought it was the end. I never imagined that moment, that horrible moment, would save my life. Elena died in 2003 at the age of 77, of natural causes. At her funeral in the Holon Cemetery, her grandchildren found a small wooden box hidden in her closet. Inside was a pair of gray socks, old, worn, frayed by time. No one understood their meaning until her eldest daughter, Miriam, explained through tears. They were the socks Elena had been given the night of the inspection in Lichtenwald. She had kept them for 58 years, never washed, never worn again, preserved as the most valuable object she owned. Sarah Blum survived as well. She was liberated the same day by the same Soviet army. She returned to Poland searching for her family and found no one. Her apartment in Warsaw was occupied by strangers. Her university had been destroyed. Nothing of her former life remained. In 1950, she emigrated to the United States through a Jewish aid organization and settled in Brooklyn, New York. There, she became a literature teacher at a high school in Crown Heights and taught for 30 years, shaping generations of students who never knew the full story of her past. In 1978, she published a memoir titled The Feet That Held Us Up, dedicating an entire chapter to the inspection of February 1945. she wrote with devastating clarity. They took everything from us. Names, families, dignity, a future. And yet that night, someone tried to give back something so simple, so forgotten, that we didn't even know we needed it anymore. The ability to keep walking, the chance to take one more step. Sarah Bloom died in 1995 at the age of 74. She was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Queens, wearing her shoes, exactly as she had explicitly requested in her will. "I want to be buried with shoes," she wrote. In Lichtenwald, they even took that from us. Miriam Kaplan, the teenager who didn't understand the order and cried in blind panic, survived physically, but never recovered mentally. She was liberated at 16 and spent the next 3 years in a psychiatric hospital in Sweden that treated Holocaust survivors. Doctors diagnosed her with severe trauma, chronic nightmares, and an inability to form relationships. She emigrated to Argentina in 1952 through distant family contacts and lived anonymously in Buenos Aires. She never married, never had children, never formed close bonds with anyone. She worked cleaning houses in the once neighborhood until her death in 1989. According to her neighbors, she never spoke about the war, never mentioned Poland or her murdered family, but every night before sleeping, she took off her shoes and silently examined her feet. A compulsive ritual no one understood. Hannah Rosen, the silent widow who had lost both her children, also survived liberation, at least physically. She returned to Lublin in the summer of 1945, searching for any trace of them, even knowing they were dead. She checked records, lists, improvised cemeteries. She found nothing. Only ruins. Only silence. In July 1945, 3 months after her release, she took her own life in the room where she had once lived with her family. On the kitchen table, she left a single sentence, written in trembling handwriting. "My feet no longer have anywhere to go." Rosa Malin, as mentioned, died in the camp 4 days after the inspection. Her name appears on the official list of Lichtenwald victims, dated February 18, 1945. The recorded cause of death is multiple organ failure. There is no mention of infection, no mention of unbearable pain, no mention that she died because there were not enough antibiotics to save her, no mention that it was a deliberate choice, just a line in a registry no one would read for decades. Dr. Ernst Vogel was arrested by Soviet authorities in May 1945 while attempting to flee west. He was tried for war crimes in 1947 in one of the tribunals established in the Soviet occupation zone. During the 3-week trial, contradictory testimonies were presented. Some survivors, among them Elena Weiss, stated that he had tried to help within the impossible limits of the system. Others argued that he was complicit simply by working there, by being part of the machinery of death. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He served 8 in a Soviet prison in East Germany and was released in 1955, ill with tuberculosis and mentally broken. He died in East Berlin in 1961 at the age of 58. He never spoke publicly about Lichtenwald. He never wrote memoirs. He never gave interviews. He took his secrets to the grave. SS Hauptscharführer Franz Adler disappeared in April 1945 during the camp's final evacuation and was never captured. Some documents declassified decades later suggest he escaped to South America under a false identity, possibly to Argentina or Paraguay, where many Nazis found refuge. Others indicate he died during the final bombings of Berlin in the last days of the war. His true fate was never confirmed. His name appears on lists of wanted war criminals. He was never found. Barrack Number 7 no longer exists. It was demolished in 1952 during the conversion of the site into a memorial administered by the government of East Germany. But in the museum that now occupies part of the original grounds, there is a small display case on the second floor with personal objects recovered from prisoners during archaeological excavations. Among them is a pair of ruined shoes, no laces, soles completely separated from the leather. The plaque beside the object, written in German and English, reads, "Shoes of an unidentified female prisoner, found in Barrack No. 7, 1945. No one knows whether they belonged to Elena Weiss, to Rosa Mollin, to Sarah Blum, to Hannah Rosen, or to Miriam Kaplan. No one knows if those shoes were truly present during the February inspection. But they are there, behind glass, in silence, mute witnesses to a moment that altered the fate of hundreds of women the world tried to erase. The order, 'I want to see your feet,' does not appear in official history books about World War II. There are no monuments dedicated to it. No Hollywood films dramatize it. No documentary series explains it. It is a microscopic fragment within the immense horror of the Holocaust. But for the women who lived it, it was the precise moment when survival depended on something as simple, as forgotten, as the condition of their own feet. History shows us that horror does not always arrive as gas chambers or firing squads. Sometimes it arrives as constant cold, endless dampness, untreated infections, feet that stop responding and drag the entire body toward death. And sometimes, in the middle of absolute horror, someone makes a decision that is neither heroic nor noble, but that allows a few more people to see one additional sunrise, one more day of life. Elena Weiss lived 77 years. Sarah Blum lived 73. Miriam Kaplan lived 63. Each of those lives, with all their years, children, jobs, joys, and sorrows, existed because on one February night in 1945, someone looked at their feet and decided they could still be saved. That is the invisible legacy of an order that sounded cruel, but that, in the darkest context of human history, became the thinnest line between the abyss and the light. A line that ran, quite literally, through their feet. If you know someone from your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero will be yours.